pistons that are decent enough to run those things.
Oh, I may have got this train. Hang on for a second. Yeah, he's been going back and forth today. It's the first time I caught one of them big ones on this route. They got these new ones they bought from Norfolk Southern. So I got the camera running. Don't do any profanities or any top secret stuff. So I got some junk piles here. One of them is the 562 series. I've got just a bunch of stuff from dead saws, a variety of piles. And what this exercise is here is to answer one of the questions I get all the time. And there's like this fear in the saw community that you can't work on the Autotunes saws without the special common service tool and the Stihl equivalent. And that's not entirely true, because it's still a saw. About the only thing you really have to keep together is the carburetor that's been flashed to the ignition system, or an ignition system with the same number. Okay? And if you do that, you should be able to put it together and run. And that's part of what the exercise is today. Is I took out this ignition system right here, and it has, for its numbers, 581 617 That's what it has up here. If this ignition right here has got the same numbers, and it does, I should be able to put that ignition system right in the same saw and have it run. So that is the exercise that we're going to go through today to see whether or not we can make that happen. Point being that we're into the guts of the saw, and we may end up going further into the saw. I haven't decided just yet. And we're going to do all of that without common service tool. One of the things that I always look at is these flywheel side seals. This one looks pretty good. This saw here has got a lot of time on it. I mean, hundreds of hours of time when I had last looked at that saw in common service tool. So it's earned its money. It's at the end of its life. This is when a lot of the saws are thrown away or traded in or just thrown in the barn. And really on these ignitions, the biggest pain is the fact there's two pains on these saws. Actually, the new 572 is eliminated. One is this wire right here that goes from the ignition to the switch, but also to the ground. See that right there? That ground goes all the way across the other side of the case. But this goes underneath the flywheel, and that creates a problem for me. You have to stuff it down in there and then put the flywheel on. When you look down at the tray, you've got the screws that hold the tray together right here. There's 4 of them. The one down there is where you got to push this little wire across to get it in there. I think I'm going to do it tomorrow. Alright, just a quick review. But basically the premise I'm trying to work with here is there's this big fear about Autotunes and somehow you can't work on a saw. Well, this saw didn't run. And basically you have to go through the basics, right? I checked the compression. It was about 140, not quite what I wanted, but it was good enough. Should run. It wouldn't start whatsoever. So I didn't do a vac test on it. I mean, that's what you would do really next. And I figured instead of going there, let me just start swapping parts in, because this really is the essence of people's fears, that somehow you have to go to a dealer if there was something wrong with an Autotune saw. And there was obviously something wrong with this saw. It wouldn't start. So what I did was simply use the same carburetor that was on this saw, because I didn't see any reason to change it, and I put in a different ignition system than what was flashed with that carb, but has the same numbers. Now the question is it going to start? And you're going to find out, and we're going to find out together. What my theory is, because I spent a fair amount of time with these things, is absolutely it's going to start. There's no problem at all. And I changed the spark plug, and like I said, I got this ignition out of it. It should fire right off, because I did not change the firmware in that carburetor. It's the same firmware as it had before, and it was tied up to a ignition that had the right number when the firmware was set. And as long as you keep the carburetor firmware with the ignition that it was tied to, or an ignition with the same number, it should work fine. Let's see. Case in point. I guess where this came from is I was on Facebook this morning, and there was a thread, and the thread was something on the along the lines of, should I get a 372X torque or a 572, something like that. And I mean, that's a legitimate question. There's people who like 372X torques. There's good reasons for that. There's people who like the Autotunes, and there's reasons for that. But almost all the objections that were articulated was, well, I don't want an Autotune. And then the next question is obviously why? Well, because I can't work on one. But you can, that's the point. And, well, you have to have a dealer to touch that saw if something goes wrong. So what this whole 15-minute segment it's about is that's a bunch of crap. And it's the same with the Stihls. I mean, it really is not unique to Husqvarna. But basically, just because it has this Autotune setup doesn't mean anything else mechanically is different than other saws. You still have to have primary compression. You still have to have secondary compression. You can do leak down tests on these just like any other saw. You can do my brake clean test on this just like any other saw. Doing the basic mechanics on these things is really no different than a saw that doesn't have Autotune. So the entire premise about how you can't work on these saws is false. It really is. Yeah, the limitation is if you buy a new carburetor, or you pick a carburetor that had a different ignition, or you pick an ignition that had a different carburetor, those instances you require a firmware update. The second thing was, well, geez, I don't want the saw to be at my dealer throwing codes. One guy literally said this, throwing codes that nobody understands, for weeks or months, whatever the time period was, but it was a long period of time. To which my first reaction is, hey, you know, the CST giving error codes and a operating history really doesn't preclude any other mechanical test. You can still do a compression test, leak down test, or a brake clean test, whichever you choose. Brake clean's a lot easier if it's running. You know, all the basics that you would have to do to repair that saw don't require a common service tool. What you get out of common service tool is a bunch of additional information, which actually makes the analysis easier. So it should not be a liability relative to working on the saw. In fact, common service tool is an asset that the dealer brings to the table. Then you had one guy going, well, geez, I'm a wrench. I work on these things. I go, you do? So I asked him some basic questions, and of course he didn't have a clue. Which brings up a third point, is there's an awful lot of people who present like they understand these Autotunes and say bad things about them like they actually have their hands on them. But when you go to the first level of questioning, you understand that no, they never did. You know, therefore, the whole Autotune concept is kind of poisoned because of the messaging of so-called experts who've never really done anything with them or never learned how, and because of their limitations in dealing with it, they have a negative connotation. Choose an X-Torque over an Autotune for other reasons, not because of Autotune, I guess. These things are pretty reliable, and as I just did here, you can mix and match. It's not a bad thing. I think I'm going to run this saw. I've got two saws here that I want to focus on over the next couple of weeks. First, I just want to get them up and running. One is this Shop 441. And of course, this is an early generation 562. I think this is like a 2014 model. Now, I've said over and over again that somewhere around 2016 and later, these things got pretty solid. That doesn't mean that the early ones don't run, you know. It's just that the later ones have a chance of running longer and running better, that's all. But when you've got an early one that runs, like, hey, it's a good saw. Run it until it stops. Don't just say, oh my God, it's an older version, it's no good. I don't think that's productive for anybody. So anyway, I got these two orphan saws, two models that are not the most popular, that people have all kinds of resistance to. This one because it's Autotune and the early 562s had issues. This one I believe is because Stihl went to the spring type anti-vibe system, and that was not accepted well because it had a different feel. But I think a 441 was a good saw. I like them. I like the 461 better, but these weren't a bad saw at all. And it was sort of like the diving into the pool for Stihl on this kind of anti-vibe, but also to the Autotune stuff. So it was a changing of the guard saw. And of course, just like when Husqvarna did that with the 575 and 576, there was resistance from the, you know, in the base, you know. So there's my rant, but I hope you find these two saws interesting. So let's do a little bit of show and tell here. When they first came out, and we went through this, they had a lot of teething issues. The point I want to make is there's been an evolution in the 562. And the second point I want to make, I'm not going to belabor it, but if anyone thinks that any new groundbreaking saw is not going to go through the same kind of teething issues that Husqvarna did, they're fooling themselves. It's not just chainsaws, it's motorcycles, it's just technology in general, it's human beings. You start out with a great idea, and often lots of that concept was modeled on high-end CAD/CAM systems. They want to get to market as soon as possible. They rely an awful lot on the computer modeling. And that gets a lot, it sure does. Now Husqvarna has gone through that with the 562. And the third point I want to make is the 572, they're so much further along in understanding not just the technology of the saw, but also the technology of the modeling and all those other things they used to design the saw and test it before it got out into the field. That the 572 gets the benefits of the learning curve, not just from the 550 and 562, but also the design tools and modeling tools and the manufacturing systems they put in place. So the 572 and the upcoming 585, 592 series are going to be, in my mind, they have a much better chance of having a good release because they've got all this background and all the related things. So just to get things off my table, a few years back, Husky was selling these short blocks. They still do, and I believe there's another update coming out soon. And it really took the need for a shop to do the things that I do, busting cases apart and putting bearings together and things like that and assembling the cases. It allows a shop, for less money sometimes than the individual parts, to take one of those saws and just do a radical upgrade, because these are upgraded, these bottom ends. So this is a short block from last year. These are cases from a few years before that, because I was doing the changes from the 5-screw case to the 6-screw case, right? And these were pretty inexpensive, so I just get a new case set and just wrap the saw around it. It was being pretty successful. Well, what does that mean when I say 5 versus 6-screw cases? This is all review. If you go back to my videos, it's all there. Well, this is one of the early versions of that saw. And you'll see a stiffening rib right there. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screws. You have a locating pin and a locating pin. And then what was happening was because of, this is actually to get us a lot of subjects. The way the cylinder was mounted and where the muffler was right here. The exhaust gases were hitting the muffler. There's a baffle that deflected them down, would heat up the bottom of that muffler, which would radiate to the cases, and these would flex, and a bunch of the bar oil would leak out from underneath that. So Husqvarna came up with an upgrade. Now the point is that when they did that, all those 5-screw case 2012 era 562s, you could put the 6-screw case in them. So they could wrap that saw around the new cases. And this was what they came up with. And these are 6-screw cases. And I don't know if I've got, no, I've got screws in there. But they added another screw right here. Basically to tie that together a little bit tighter and eliminate the problem of this flexing and oil coming out. With the 6-screw case, you can see there's an additional boss for the screw that's not on the 5-screw cases. And now the question is, will your saw run with a 5-screw set of cases? I bet there's a bunch of them out there still running just fine, thank you very much. That usually showed up in, you know, a production level saw, something that was being run hard. But there was an awful lot of guys with the first set of 562s that run just fine. And these cases, I think, were released, this particular set I think I bought somewhere around 2014 or 15 when I was doing all those cases. Now, the other litany was carburetors. And I'm just going to go up to 2016. I'm not going to get into the later ones. That's going to be a different video. But the first carburetors, the AL44s, made plugging in common service tool an act of God, really. You really had to tear apart this plug right here to plug it in. And that was very difficult. Well, the EL46s, they had the ability of unplugging this, and you could plug your common service tool to that port. And that's the way they are now. The 572s, they have it sitting on top of the carburetor, which makes it even easier yet. Any saw that has the EL48 or later carburetor is probably just fine, because by the time they got to the EL48s, things were pretty stable. And the other thing is, if you got an older one with an EL46 or something like that, if it's running fine, run it. It's not going to stop just because it has a EL46 on the side. If it's running now, it's going to run, you know, for quite some time. It's just, again, it's one of those things where it's not that every saw with the 5-screw case and every saw with an EL44 or 46 is going to fail. It was just some of them did. So yeah, all these things retro back. It just doesn't mean that because you have the older version of the saw that you have to panic and go change things. You change them when there's a problem. If there's no problem, run them. And I think the other point I want to make is one of the beauties of the common service tool is the new firmware helps mitigate some of the issues of some of those early saws. So it's worthwhile to do that. It's not going to fix it all the time if it's a mechanical thing, but it could make it run better. It's worth doing. So I've got 2 EL48 carburetors right here. And we'll use them. I don't know where, but we'll use them. Both of them already have firmware. Theme being, if it's already flashed, if you know what ignition it had on there, and you get one with the same numbers, it's going to work. This is a brand new crankshaft, brand spanking new OEM crankshaft, inside a 2260 set of cases. You know how I can tell it's a 2260? It's because it got stuffers. If it was a 2258, it would have no stuffers, just like a Husqvarna 555. I think I went through this in one of my videos. This has got new bearings, new crank. It's ready for a saw. I've got it sitting on the shelf collecting dust. What happened with this saw was it got left outside. You can't make this stuff out. Just one of my guys, one of my customers, you know, they leave all their stuff in the truck. Well, this one was left in an orientation where literally rain got into the saw. It came in, I believe, through the muffler. I believe it was standing handle down, muffler up. Rainstorms, rainstorms, rainstorms. They couldn't get to start. We bring it into the shop, and I just remember going through the standard routine of saying, okay, what's wrong? Pulling the spark plug, pulling the thing over, and having water shooting up and out. And if you look at it, you can see where there's a little bit of corrosion on the crank. My hunch is those bearings are just fine. But he was all freaked out, so we put a short block in it and wrapped the saw around it, and he spent $200 and had effectively a new bottom end and a good running saw, and it's still out there. And I've got these cases, and I think what I'm going to do on cases like this is to make the point, they sure aren't perfect, but I bet we can make them run. You know what I'm saying? This is a 2013 562. I honestly don't know what died on this saw. It looks like we could clean this one up and make it run too. Now, what I may do for the channel on a saw like this is I might go through and just tear it apart and put bearings in there like I do in the 372s, just to show you all that it can be done. It's not rocket science. It's just like any other saw. And I'll go back to the same theme and put on one of these already flashed used EL48s and gamble with the ignition. My bet is it runs just fine. So this is another 2013. Another thing I like about this series of saw is even the latest version of 562 parts will retro back to these. Whether it's wrapping a saw around a set of cases, or the new carb, the new air filter, covers, all those things you can put on the older saws, and then bring those older saws up to a greater spec if there's a need. I just simply, I don't think, you know, it's worth panicking on these things. If they work, just keep them going. That's a good piston right there. Well, I think I'm going to borrow the bar and chain from my L77 here for just a short period of time. And then, that thing has a will to live. You know what I'm saying? These saws are awesome. Excellent, excellent designs. Again, this is from the mid-1970s. It's an L77, and there's a whole series of these. The L66 and L77, and they're excellent. What a way ahead of their time design they are for power and weight, what they produce. You know, these things just impress me. They really do. Really fortunate to have one of these, and thank you so much, Bob, for doing that, because there's the longest time I saw these orange pumpkins I just simply didn't engage, you know. They were just old saws. But now that I understand what they are, these things are just awesome. There's a few things I'm going to do pretty early on once I get this running and oiling and actually doing the things it's supposed to do. One is I like taking out that material on the cover right there to let it blow more air to the back of the cylinder. Did that early on. The new ones have got a slot cut up in there to do the same thing. And we're going to do something to that muffler. You know, we'll get into that later. But for now, let's get a bar and chain on it and see if we can cut some wood. Well, I got to put that on hold because it's just leaking gas out of everywhere. So what I'm going to do right now is go change the oil filter on my John Deere 2750. Baldwin filters were the ones we used to use at the highway department. And little did I know, well, the store brand for Tractor Supply is that very Baldwin company. I've been dying to see if I can make this thing work. Son of a gun, look at that. Alright, this is the John Deere brand. What we got right here is that 562, and what I'm going to do is fire it up and we're going to tune it up. And basically what we have to do is give it 30 or 40 seconds at part throttle to let the computer set itself for this particular weather condition. Now remember, this saw hadn't been run for a long time, other than me just running it in the shop for a couple of minutes, but it actually hasn't done any work. So that's how you tune one of these things up. Probably about 15 degrees out, maybe a little colder. So I guess the other thing is that's cold gas, cold oil, in cold conditions, doing just fine. I think I'm going to call this segment "This Old 562."